Hey, this is Jack Russell from Jack Russell's Great White, and you're listening to Thunder Underground.
Welcome to episode 402 of the Thunder Underground podcast. Trent here as always. And this episode is not a typical one, as it's a tribute, as you can tell right there in the title. This will be a tribute to Jack Russell, who unfortunately passed away a little over a week ago. Spoken about it a couple times on the episodes I've put out since then, but wanted to do an episode that stood on its own just so I could, talk a little more about my thoughts on Jack Russell. I had the opportunity, the privilege or honor, or whatever other adjective you want to use, to interview Jack Russell earlier this year. I believe the actual interview took place in February, and that episode came out in March. It's episode 390, so if you have not heard that one yet, go check it out. We talked a lot about his most recent release, which could stand as his final release of new material, which was Russell Guns, the album he put out with Tracii Guns, which is very cool. They're something we talked about, their styles blend very well together. Tracii's guitar has always had a very blues-based influence to it, and of course we know that Jack Russell sits squarely in that area of music. So check that one out if you have not yet. We also, of course, talked about the stuff he's been doing with Jack Russell's Great White, and of course a lot of history with Great White as well. So that, like I said, was episode 390. Huge honor for me, because when Jason and I started this podcast about almost 9.5 years ago, it was May of 2015. We had hopes and dreams of being able to one day interview, musicians we loved or grew up loving. And little did we know that, it would expand to what it did. And we get to talk to a lot of those artists that, we grew up as fans of or that we're currently fans of. And the fact that Jack Russell was always one of those guys on my list of the dream list of hoping that I could talk to the guy on this podcast, so I'm so thankful that was able to happen this year before he ultimately passed away. So, just kind of jumping into it, since I was young, I've always been a huge fan of Great White. And their, at least popularity on the radio was perfect timing for me to become a big fan, because I've stated many times throughout the years of this podcast, my age in the late 80s. I was 10 in 1987. Okay, so that kind of tells you where we're at. So when I was really, just going from being a surface music fan of what you would randomly hear on, the hits or the pop stations, to actively listen to stations that were playing rock and getting really heavy into the 80s rock of the time, like Def Leppard and Bon Jovi, Motley Crue, all that stuff. Great White was squarely in the middle of it. They were having huge hits in 87, 89. They had already, been out for several years, established at that point. I can't really say what it was that instantly grabbed me when I first heard them, but it's a band that very much, to me, not to jump into this, right now. I wasn't even going to talk about it, but it's just coming to my head. But, everybody complains about the whole, Sebastian Bach and Skid Row thing, just like people do, in the past decade with Jack Russell and Great White. I fully believe that both entities are perfectly fine on their own. They still make great music and still put on great shows, but I fully believe that these guys are at their peak when they're together. And you could say that about any band with their original or their classic lineup. But I fully feel that Great White the sound of Audie's keyboards, the sound of Mark's guitar, and the sound of Jack's voice, to me, that is Great White. And these guys weren't shocking the world with, something we had never heard. They were rooted in everything that rock and roll was ever rooted in, which was blues and attitude. And they, there's so many of these, not so many, but there's several bands, that were around at that time that had blues influence, like Cinderella or Junkyard or Tesla. But Great White, I think, wore that badge even more than any of them. And you could hear it in their music because their music was very expansive in the fact that, they had full-on hard rock songs. Full-on almost sleazy hard rock songs that fit perfect into what was going on in the 80s. And then they had full-on blues, laid back. They had full-on acoustic-based rock. They had saxophone solos. They had piano solos. They had everything encompassing into this hard rock band. In the forefront of it all was that voice that at times would get compared, to some of those guys from the 70s, and rightfully so. But he still had a very unique voice that when you heard it, you knew who you were listening to. You didn't think, oh, is this guy so-and-so? No, you knew it was Jack Russell and Great White. And one of the things that has always jumped out to me is that the 80s and the very beginning of the 90s was known, especially the late 80s, was known as a time that was very ballad heavy when it came to hard rock music. There's several bands from that era where their biggest hit is a love song or a ballad. There's others where it isn't, Rat, kind of made a living out of, they had like one hit ballad, and it's not even something that most people even think about when they think about Rat. But, there's other bands that very well, that's their calling card. But then there's bands like Great White, like I said, that were so great at both ends of this. But I mentioned the ballads because I believe on a whole, Great White had better ballads overall than any band of that era. And there's songs from other bands you can throw into the top of the list, sure. But I'm talking about not one or two songs. I'm talking about every ballad they ever wrote. Because it didn't sound like some Desmond Child cookie cutter, here, let's write this song and hope Paul Stanley sings it live, so we can make a lot of money type song. This is legit, beautiful, like I said, blues-based rock and roll. The Angel Song, House of Broken Love, and Save Your Love, which is, one of their biggest hits, and it is, I believe, one of the greatest ballads ever written, not just in this genre. In the old story of that, the Great White and Jack Russell had told about, for years, going back to the 90s, was that Save Your Love, the studio, or that, not this, excuse me, their record label did not want that included on the album for some reason. I can't remember what they were saying, if it was just too slow, it didn't have the, that huge bombastic chorus like I just mentioned, where we're talking about a 80s Kiss ballad, or a Poison ballad or whatever. It was just a beautiful fucking song. And it stands the test of time. And I remember in interviews after Terry Alou joined the band, he mentioned that Save Your Love, I think in an interview someone had asked him, what, like you do when a new guy comes into a band, what are your favorite songs of theirs, or what's your favorite songs to sing? And he mentioned that Save Your Love was one of his, not his favorite Great White songs, but one of his all-time favorite songs ever. And I think a lot of people would say that. I mean, Great White, their biggest hit, of course, is Once Bitten, Twice Shy, and it's a cover song, which, like there's bands out there that have one huge hit as a cover song, and people always kind of rip on that, but it doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme when it comes to Great White. So much great music from Jack Russell and this band. And you go back to the beginning with their debut album in 84, of course it had the infamous On Your Knees and Stick It. And these guys kind of got their foot in the door, with this. And then Shot in the Dark came out. Great album. Face the Day, an all-time classic right there. And, as they kept going, their albums just started getting more and more hits. And in 87, Once Bitten came out, which is, I think most people would put at the top. They have a couple albums that I like better, but you can't not put this album at the top. When an album has Save Your Love, like I already mentioned, Lady Red Light, Rock Me, Mistreat Her, and one of their top 5 songs ever, in my opinion, All Over Now, all on the same album. Unbelievable. Okay. And 2 hours later, wow. Okay, sorry guys, I'm, tired from last night. I worked the Jane's Addiction show, so regardless, random total side note there, but 2 years later, in 1989, the album Twice Shy came out. And this, of course, again, Missed a Bone, The Angel Song, House of Broken Love, Once Bitten, Twice Shy, Move It, Heart the Hunter. This album is stacked as well. And I just thought it was so cool, because that's probably about the time I was getting into them. I would say 88, 89. And I just, always when I was young, was just so, captivated with the fact that they had 2 albums, one called Once Bitten, one called Twice Shy. And the song Once Bitten, Twice Shy was on the second album. And, maybe that's why they covered Once Bitten, Twice Shy after, they put out Once Bitten. It played in with of course, a lot of their album titles and things, played into the idea of sharks, blah, blah, blah. You don't need me to explain that. But I don't know. When I was a kid, I just thought that was so cool that, and it's still, a cool thing that doesn't really, mean anything in the grand scheme of things, but just, throwing that in here because I'm talking off the cuff here. I did not make an outline. I did not do anything. I just thought, I'm going to talk about Jack Russell, see where this leads me. But so then, shortly after Twice Shy, they released the album Hooked, which again, at the age I was at, that was 91, 2 years later. In 91, I was 14 years old. This was at the point, by 91, 90, I was like head first, enamored with all of that stuff, all of the 80s stuff. And by this point, I was totally into, thrash metal and everything. But I still loved all these bands. Still loved Great White. That never changed from that moment to this moment. But Hooked came out in 91. So I tell you all this to tell you at 14 that I fully believe that the album cover for Hooked was the greatest album cover ever released on a piece of music in the history of music. Okay. I'm now in my 40s, so I'm a grown man and I've seen a lot more stuff than that. So I'm just throwing that out there. I'm sure that many other, guys of my generation, of my age, probably thought the same thing. But if you're not familiar with that album cover, it still holds its weight, I would say. But the opening track on Hooked was Call It Rock and Roll. This is, again, for me, right up there, one of their all-time greats. Lovin' Kind, Desert Moon, Afterglow. Such a great album. Kind of overlooked, I think, in a way, because of the albums, previous to it. But that would be the case for, most artists of this genre, or most artists of that time period, because by 91, this was still going strong, but then the next year was kind of when everything started shifting, of course, late 91 into 92 with the changing music. But that's something else I wanted to speak on, because, Great White, like many bands, still kept releasing music. They didn't try to shift their sound like a band like, say, Warrant did or something, where, they tried to fit the mold of what was going on. But in 92, they released Psycho City, which is my favorite Great White Album. And I say, changing sound, this still sounded definitely like Great White, but it was a much darker kind of feel, just not dark in the sense of like, Slayer or Behemoth, but it's, just dark in the sense of what, you think of Once Bitten, Twice Shy, And the album is something that we talked about on the episode that I had with Jack Russell earlier this year. I brought it up, and mentioned that it was, my favorite album of the, of the band, and I just thought it was overlooked and it's always been underrated. And Jack agreed and talked a little bit about the recording of it and his thoughts on, kind of the sound from that time period. But my favorite Great White song of all time is Big Goodbye, which is on this album. High up there is also Love Is a Lie. This ballad, to me, is as good as Save Your Love. It's kind of a 1A, 1B kind of thing. I would put Save Your Love just slightly ahead of it, but Love Is a Lie, it's like an 8-minute long epic that just has everything you want and just a perfect kind of, I don't know where I'm going with that, just a perfect epic, quote unquote love song, love lost, whatever. But, Mark Kendall's guitar solo on that's insane. The keyboard piano solo is insane. Jack's vocals are insane. It's just such a dark, moving piece of music, in my opinion. And the rest of the album, Old Rose Motel, Maybe Someday, Doctor Me, I Want You. I just absolutely, can't press this album enough to people. Because by then, this is definitely when the tide started shifting. But I still remember Love Is a Lie, getting some airplay. And, I thought that was cool. But then we shift forward slightly to the next album, which was Sail Away. And this came out in 94. So now we're in the heart of the complete musical climate has completely changed. And by 94, if you heard a Poison song or a Warrant song or a Motley Crue song on the radio, it was, you might be listening to a random rock format that hadn't changed its format yet, because most of them by that point had changed their format to, rock alternative or whatever. But Sail Away, I thought this was brilliant timing because this album was, acoustic based. And I fully remember, all I can speak about is where I'm from, which is in the Midwest, which is the heart of, people who hang on to things too long, maybe. Who knows? But right here in Oklahoma, on the rock radio stations, they were playing the song Sail Away. Right in between Smashing Pumpkins, Nirvana, and Alice in Chains. And it didn't sound like, obviously it sounded different, but it didn't sound like, why are they playing some random hair band from the 80s or whatever, because Great White was one of those bands that if you didn't know what genre they are in, you could throw them, into all different formats of rock radio and it just would seem to work, a lot of their songs. But again, this album, like I said, acoustic based, All Right, is such a beautiful song. Living in the USA is cool. It's such a cool album. And I remember back when I got it, what blew my mind and blew a lot of people's mind was that it had a bonus disc with it. It was a 2 CD set. The second CD was a live album. And, it wasn't like a full album. I think it had 6 or 8 songs. I had this pulled up a minute ago. Here we go. Let me find it. Yeah, it had 7 songs. And one of the 7 songs was a cover of Led Zeppelin's Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You. This also, in the Oklahoma world of rock and roll, got played a shitload on the radio amidst all the alternative and grunge and everything else going on. That, of course, led to later. I need to look this up. I should have had it pulled up. When Great White released the Great Zeppelin album, which I believe was the mid to late 90s, and they did a full concert. You know, I don't remember the specifics on where it was recorded, or I'm sure they had like a set where they played Great White songs, but they did like a full 15 song set, including, you know, even Stairway to Heaven, a song that people don't touch. They did a full complete concert of nothing but Zeppelin covers, full on, you know, When the Levee Breaks, The Rover, Thank You, Going to California, Since I've Been Loving You, Living Loving Maid, Ramble On. And I don't remember, I'm sure, of course, now, especially if you looked online and someone was talking about this, people are going to be talking highly about it, but you're always going to have your internet trolls or your dorks, and they're talking about how, it sucks, it's not Zeppelin, whatever. But I remember, at least at the time, I don't remember ever hearing anyone say anything negative about this, which says a lot, you know, because Zeppelin is one of those bands that are held in the highest, you know, echelon of rock and roll royalty, like a top 5 band in the grand scheme of things when it comes to most everybody's thoughts. And Great White recorded a full album with Jack singing songs that a lot of people wouldn't even attempt to sing, and fucking nailed it. So that is something that you need to check out if you never have. So we could jump forward, you know, since we're talking about that, way into the future. A few years ago, Jack Russell's Great White released, you know, a great Zeppelin 2. This one was studio. And it is very, very well done as well. This isn't some slapped together bullshit, you know, just to like, you know, put a product out. This was like very well put together. And you wouldn't expect anything less with this being a big a fan of Zeppelin as Jack Russell is. And I'm sure, you know, Robbie and other guys in Jack Russell's Great White feel the same way. So again, something else you might want to check out if you haven't. The late 90s brought another Great White album. Can't Get There From Here. You know, it had a song called Rolling Stoned on it that, you know, kind of over the course of time, you know, became a quote unquote hit, you know, because if you look at it on streaming services, I was always kind of surprised when I'd go back and see, like, here, I had Spotify pulled up a minute ago. Here we go. Yeah. Okay. Rolling Stoned. Yeah, on Spotify alone has almost 16 million plays, which is, you know, pretty not mind-blowing or baffling or whatever, but just kind of crazy for an artist from that, like I said, from that genre where a lot of people blow off things they shouldn't blow off just because of the time period, or they, you know, have some dumbass, you know, preconceived notion on what something is. But, you know, the point is, you know, 15 million or 16 million views, like I said, that's almost 4 times as many, streams. That's almost 4 times as many streams as Save Your Love has on Spotify. I'm looking at this right now. It is literally their 3rd highest listened to song on Spotify, behind Once Bitten, Twice Shy and Rock Me. It's got more streams than Call It Rock and Roll, House of Broken Love, you know, Missed a Bone, Lady Red Light, all the... Anyway, but, you know, I just thought that was cool because, you know, there was a few of those bands that managed to have hits, you know, long after. You know, Firehouse had a hit in like 96 on, you know, pop radio when, you know, and I didn't even know that until a few years later. I mean, I knew the song, but you don't know what's going on if you're not listening to that, you know, that format of music or whatever. But again, back to Jack Russell. You know, since, you know, his, you know, split with Great White, you know, he started Jack Russell's Great White. Had the chance to see him live. Very well done. Like I said, you know, I'm not one of those people that, you know, would rip the original Great White because he wasn't in it. You know, I'm still a fan. You know, the way I kind of look at it is, you know, we got 2 good versions of out there of music. You know, you had one with the original kind of sound and one with the original voice. You know, and hell, Jack Russell's Great White also had Tony Montana. So you had, you know, 2 of the original 5, right? So, but so much stuff that, I just kind of implore people to look into if you're kind of just a surface fan or a casual fan, or you just know the radio songs. Great White's one of those bands to me that you can hit shuffle on their entire catalog and not, want to skip anything. They put out another album in 2007 or 8 called Back to the Rhythm, which was also very well. I believe that was the last studio thing they did with Jack in the band. Great White later released a couple albums. Like I said, I love Terry I. Lou, and I just always kind of appreciated the fact that, they got someone in there that wasn't a clone of Jack Russell. But then again, I just said that out loud, and we flash forward to now, and that's exactly what the band has. Which, taking nothing away from Brett Carlisle, the guy sounds great. He's in his mid-20s. It makes sense. Because, unfortunately, there's going to be people at a Great White show right now, or a few years from now, that have no clue that Jack Russell isn't in the band, has no clue that Jack Russell passed away. Because, you got to remember, you're listening to a music podcast. You're more than a casual fan. You fucking know this, and you've known it for years. I know this, but that's the thing. A good majority of people that go to concerts aren't, it's just, anyway, I regress. I don't know where I'm going with that. Like I said, Jack's voice, very distinguishable. Great White's music, very well, it's one of those bands that is very well known with many hits, but I also believe was very underrated in the grand scheme of things, because like I said earlier, just the fact that they could cross the lines on so much different style and still do it with ease. And, it's a huge loss. The guy suffered a lot over the past 15, 20 years. He had that boat accident, which led to him having addiction to pain meds, which he beat, and, and of course, what ultimately happened. And, even, when I got to interview him, he had gotten on there and said he was having a rough morning, but he still, powered through that interview with, class and, humor, and was just a great person to talk to. So again, like I said, I'm very honored that I got the chance to have him on this podcast, episode 390. I'm very happy that I got the chance to see him live many times throughout the years. And just happy, of course, that we've got a lifetime's worth of music that we can enjoy and listen to. One of the things that he mentioned on that podcast was some of the stuff that they were looking at doing, and he had mentioned that they were going to completely re-record Twice Shy, the current Jack Russell's Great White. They were going to completely re-record Twice Shy acoustically, which I thought was great, because like I said, Jack's voice acoustic was so great, even going back to unplugged stuff, whatever, it'd been great to hear that. The way he made it sound in the interview was something that hadn't been recorded yet, but maybe we'll be lucky and maybe some of that has, and we'll one day get to hear it. But until then, we've got basically 40 years, because the first Great White album was 84, right? We got 40 years of great music and memories from this guy to hold on to. So, if you're a big fan of Jack Russell, Great White, wherever you're listening to this, or wherever you're seeing this, throw in the comments some of your favorite Great White songs, or favorite memories when you saw him live, all that kind of thing. All right, I'm going to jump out of here and just let you know that besides that episode with Jack, Mark Kendall had been on the podcast a couple times. It's been several years ago. But also many guys from that 80s rock era. You can look it up. Guys like Dee Snider, Jeff Tate, Dizzy Reed, John Corabi, tons of other guys like Gene Simmons and Glenn Hughes, Michael Monroe. 401 episodes before this you can check out. Very soon we got Tim Montana coming up, great new rock artist. And then after that, another legend of the 80s, Michael Sweet of Stryper, will be on this podcast. All right. Check us out on the socials. Give us a follow, like, share, all that great stuff. TheThunderUnderground.com. And until next time.
Thunder Underground, y'all.